Okay, welcome everybody. We have Scott Childers with us today from the Southeast Library System. And Scott is the system director there, and he's going to share a lot of information about records retention. Because as we said, it's some problem we all deal with. How long do we keep everything? So I will let you take it over, Scott, whenever you're ready.
Okay, let me get my screens up here. Oh. And one of the screens disappeared from selection. There it is. Okay. Are people seeing the what papers do I need screen? Okay. I will have the chat box up as well. So if questions come up, feel free to type them in chat if you don't feel like interrupting. And I know sometimes we're in positions where we really can't, or our microphones aren't working. So feel free to put something in chat and I'll be watching that as we go along. So many libraries decided to tackle some organizational tasks that they have set aside during the pandemic. And a question that kept coming up is, what papers do I need to keep? What records do I need to retain? And so hopefully this will give you some insight on creating your own retention policy for your library. And let's just get to the next slide. So what should we keep? And these are some guidelines for you and so we'll go through that. And Tammy sent me some questions that some of you had earlier, so hopefully I'll answer some of those along the way, but please feel free to ask. What should I keep? Library board business meeting documents. Okay, and this was a popular question. How long do I keep them? In my personal opinion, I would keep them forever in some format. Different places have different legal requirements, but library board meeting documents, especially the minutes, are going to be keys for you to avoid recreating the wheel down the line. It's amazing how fast we can forget why we made certain decisions. We remember a decision was made, but what was the rationale behind it? Especially if it's something where we implemented it right away, it got going, and then we have to revisit it because we've hit a snag in something. So these, it's not just historical, these actually can help you prevent, go rehashing discussions you've already had. You'll notice in my slide, I put documents, not just agendas, not just meeting minutes. And this comes off of some different interpretations of open meeting law. There are some city attorneys that will say anything handed out during an open meeting, such as a library board meeting, need to be included in the record. There are others that say just the agenda and minutes. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to debate, lawyers themselves. But if your city attorney, your village office does not have something, I would suggest you keep those handouts. There's been a couple times where I've worked with the library, they go to the minutes, they refer to a document that no one kept. And so that minute point, that part of the notes, you can't go back because no one kept that separate piece of paper. I will also say, there was kind of a related question, I'll mention it now, is like, what do I give the board of trustees, the board of directors, whatever term you use for it? Just remember that anything that is referenced in an open meeting, there has to also be availability of that piece of paper to be at least passed around the audience of that meeting. So that's another thing to keep track of. If you're passing out notes on bills and whatever, someone in the audience can request to see at least a copy of that document that goes to your board. So, and you should also, again, with my interpretation, you should be keeping that in your permanent record. So something to keep in mind. Financials. Speaking of financials, how long do you keep your bills? Well, part of it depends on what the workflow is between you and the village office or the clerk, or if someone else is cutting the bills or cutting the checks to pay your bills. A good rule of thumb is 7 years. That's what I've usually seen suggested. Sometimes in paper, sometimes an electronic scan copy works. I know there's some libraries that as soon as the bill gets sent off, the check gets sent off, the bill is actually scanned and put into an electronic or storage. That really depends on what your workflow is. I know there are some libraries that have issues. I don't say it's malicious, it's just some communication issues between, like if their checks are getting cut by City Hall and the library is getting the bills, sometimes things don't get paid in a timely manner or completely paid. And so the library keeps their own copy of financials. Okay, and Jack put in 10 years for corporate financials as an IRS suggestion. That works for me as well. Again, it kind of depends on that workflow. If the library is in charge of all the financials and you're the only ones keeping a record, longer is better. If you're keeping a mirror of what the village office has, then you may not have to keep as long. But that is a good suggestion, Jack. So, grant agreements. If there's a bunch of grants becoming available now, I think some of you have already applied. Whatever documentation you get, you want to hold on to for the duration of the grant. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. Sometimes those grants actually specify what documents you keep with your grant project and how long they are kept. But if they don't say anything, you want to keep those grant agreements for a period of time. More and more likely, there are written into these agreements how long those are kept. But you want to keep the actual grant documentation as well, not just the financials related to it. Keep that grant agreement. Speaking of agreements, donor agreements. And for some reason, this tends to get lost in the shuffle sometimes. Anytime a donor gives you something and there's paperwork attached, keep that paperwork. I don't know how many times I've worked with a library where they get some long-term funding through a donor. And over the years, what that funding is understood to be changes in current practice. Through different directors or different boards, things get mistranslated along the way. And now what's actually being used, what those funds are being used for, is not exactly what the donor intended. It sometimes works the other way. Sometimes what the donor intended isn't viable. When I was library director in York, I had a fund that could only buy materials on a certain subject using that money. I could not use that money for anything else. New books in that subject, maybe one got published a year. That fund was just sitting there and I couldn't use it for anything but one book a year. If I had the donor agreement, maybe I could look through it and see if there was something else. If the understanding of that fund got mistranslated to me when I took over, I couldn't find it. We had to ask around and find family members. And that could be kind of embarrassing and also politically a bad move, depending on the relationship you have with the donor's family and what the donor's family had with the donor. So keep the donor agreements. So that way you can refer to it, your successors can refer to it, the board can refer to it. Those are useful documents to keep track of. This one, correspondence with new or problematic vendors. And I forgot to mention, those donor agreements you hold on to until all the funds go away and all the things you bought with it may have taken care of. That's a long-term keep. Those you don't just get rid of once you spend the first year's money. So I forgot to mention that. Vendor communication. If you're trying out a new vendor, keep the communication that you have, all the written promises, all the sales spiels, all of that. So that way, if something goes wrong, you can go back to the written documentation and say, you promised us this. If billing becomes an issue, you can go back and look at it. At problematic vendors, I know I had a vendor once where it seemed like we were always 3 months different in settling accounts between invoice and payment and it showing up. And every so often they'd want a double bill because they had received the check, but I had sent it. So you want to keep that communication as long as you have a relationship with that vendor. Plus, I would give it maybe a year or two, depending on how that vendor goes out of business or your relationship with them ends. And the new ones until they have proven that they've got their stuff together. So, and building records. You want to keep as much information about the structure as you can. It may not help you today, but it may help you tomorrow. Things like repairs, insurance claims, additions. Going back to my time in York, we were renovating the bathrooms to make them more accessible to people in wheelchairs. We needed to adjust some of the location of the toilets and sinks and stuff. The previous director had taken pictures during initial construction of the bathroom walls, where the plumbing was going, where the electrical was going. It saved the contractor so much time, and therefore it saved the library so much money because they could go directly where they needed to go. They didn't have to rip up extra. Same with the floor drains. There's we took pictures of where they put that plumbing. So if you've got anything like that, that is a long-term keep, not just for nostalgia, but it could certainly help you save money, save aggravation if there's any repairs, any type of construction going on. It's kind of related to donor agreements too, because if the donor requested something happen and the blueprints don't have it, then you could say, especially if you inherit a building, it's like somewhere between you giving money and they building it, it didn't happen. What can we do to resolve this now that we know I'm not to blame for, the plaque outside the door not being in the right place. So those are some things you definitely want to keep. You'll notice I didn't put things like your patron records. That's going to be more towards a circulation policy. I think there was a question that came up. You tend to remove patron records that aren't viable and you're not holding because they owe money. That is a library, just a local library decision. Are you paying per patron record in your system? Well, then you're going to be really quick to get rid of old records. Are you still doing things on paper and your families are here and maybe you're not so quick on that? So that's kind of where we go with that. Let me pause for questions and I'm going to look at the question list here. Some other things to keep. There's a couple more questions that I'm going to get to it later. There were a couple of questions about if like the city office or the village office also keeps records. Do I need to keep those records? Especially financials. And I would say if they've got a good hold of things, their record keeping is spot on, you may not need to keep any financials in your library, except for things that are current, like we ordered this, they haven't come in, we're going to hold on to this until they come in. But long-term stuff, if it's with the city and they've got all of that under control, then you may not need to keep any of that in the library itself. But then again, that's going to be what's your workflow, what's the status of their record keeping, can they point you to where those records are kept? That's often a big one. If they say, yeah, we got them, and you say, okay, where can I get this copy of this bill from, last year, September? They could provide it, great. You have a good, you're building that trust. If they say, well, maybe we could get it, maybe we can't, you may want to keep on to your local copies. Again, if there's more questions on that type of stuff, feel free to put it in chat. How to decide if I should keep it. Statewide guidelines. This was a question that Tammy got through her form. Nebraska does not have statewide guidance for public libraries. There is some statewide guidance for municipal groups, but that tends to be strictly the financials, and we talked about that. You could refer to other states, and I'll show you some samples here near the end, like Kentucky and Wisconsin. They have library-specific ones. But I've looked multiple times. There is no statewide guidance. Some of the larger ones have some, but not statewide. So as far as library-specific stuff, there's not going to be statewide guidelines, so we need to decide for ourselves. Local document retention guidelines. What does City Hall say? What does the village office say? Saying that you're not going to follow their lead is probably a losing proposition, especially if it's just records retention for things other than patron records. If it's something that has patron information, yeah, there's going to be a fight if they say something other than what our privacy guidelines say. Other things, if the local group says, here's our guidelines, we expect you to follow them in the financials or the agenda or minutes, that is at least your bare minimum. So that's a good deciding point. Some things will have built-in retention guidelines, like E-rate. I don't know if any of you are still participating in the E-rate discount for your internet. I know when they took off the phones, a lot of people dropped E-rate. But if you still do, they have built-in guidelines for the forms you file and the telecom bills you get. Like, you keep the forms forever and the telecom bills for 10 years plus the current fiscal year. And it is in their guidelines. So you really don't have to think too hard about that because they tell you. And apparently something, I thought I had another one, grants. Grants will also often have built-in document retention guidelines. How long do you keep any receipts for the things you purchased with grant money? How long do you keep correspondence for the grant? So definitely, if you're applying for a grant, you received a grant, go through and look at those documentation things. Also, as a reminder, sometimes they have reporting guidelines, and you need to make sure you follow up on that so you remain eligible for grants. That's something I learned from one of Tammy's workshops. So that's another thing. There are some things that will have built-in guidelines. Otherwise, rule of thumb, financials, if you're doing it on your own, I've heard 7. Jack mentioned the IRS ones for 10. So those are kind of a good guideline. Personnel files, that really does kind of depend on other issues. I've seen around 5 to 7. And we might actually see some of those in the guidelines I put up. Patron record guidelines. It's usually the active ones, and then maybe, depending on other circumstances, 3 to 7 years of non-active patron records. That usually depends on the system you're using, how you're handling overdue. It's like, do you keep a record as long as they owe a nickel, or do you start forgiving those and only keep the ones that need to replace $20, $50, whatever? Okay. I'm going to bring up a slightly related topic, is does this document have value as a historical artifact? I know there's some librarians, they like to keep a hold of old things because they have historical value as opposed to the active use of that document. And so let's talk about that. Maybe instead of keeping the actual document, you copy it, scan it, compile it in a different format, and remove the original. This is going to be the case, especially if the original document is in really bad condition and you just want to keep some of the flavor of it. Like a photo of this will do just as much good as the actual document, and the document is starting to crumble. So we're going to take a photo and remove the original document. I've seen some people pull out the original Ascension number books of the library that they are running. Okay, that's interesting. It is a bit of history, but that same library computerized 10 years ago, and all of that information is now in computer records. So the Ascension book isn't actually helping with inventory anymore. It is purely historical. And then you have to decide, is it worth keeping here, or does this move to another facility like a museum or an archive? And that's another thing I want to talk about. Some libraries, they want to hold on to this stuff, but the heating and cooling and humidity controls are not going to help keep that document together. It could grow mold or it could crumble. So if you're keeping things for historical value, you may want to think about investing in what they call microclimates. So you can put that document into a certain type of box that's not going to have mildew grow in it. It's going to keep humidity out, keep things the way it should be. But if you're just keeping it because it has historical value, you have to think about there is going to be an investment in this preservation or conservation. And talk with archivists, museums. I will be one of the first to say the ability for county historical societies to maintain things differs greatly between county to county, and even depending who's on the board that year. I've seen it with there are some that do wonders, and then new administration comes in and all of a sudden the museum is now closed and everything is just piling up. It happens. If you've got some that seem to have a long-term commitment to keeping historical artifacts, it may be worth your time to talk with them. Okay. And electronic documents. This came up in some of the questions in the registration form. You do want to keep a hold of your electronic documents as well. Things like the documents folder on the director's computer. I don't know how many times I've been told, someone had some documents, they saved them. It was safer than paper, but then they replaced the computer. And then all that record keeping went away because someone forgot to copy the documents folder. Email. Please do not use email as your filing system. It's not designed for that. If you have attachments in your email that you want to keep, remove them from the email and save them properly. Another thing to remember is for most of our libraries, you are part of the city and your email is subpoenable. So there are certain discussions where it might benefit you to not keep it in email at all. Not saying you're being sneaky or anything. It just could point people in the wrong direction if it was a brainstorming or something like that. Again, email is not designed for record keeping. So please don't use it as a filing cabinet. Whatever you choose to do for your electronic documents, you need to realize that hard drives fail. Burnt CDs rot. If you are going to keep things digitally, you may want to think about your digital refresh, which means copying all the documents to a new hard drive or burning things to a new CD once every 10 years, once every 5 years. There are CDs that were burnt. People thought this was going to be a long-term thing, and they are completely unreadable after 7 years. There's just no way to get any of the information off of it. And that's not just burnt ones. Those are ones you bought in the store. Some of those are starting to rot and become unreadable. So CDs are not a good archival format. Hard drives are better if you're able to put things into a tape drive. Not too many people own those anymore, and it's getting harder to keep up. Those are a little bit better. Cloud services work really well. It is their business model to make sure things are up and running and not getting corrupted. That said, you need to be able to afford whatever long-term costs there are and be able to access those type of things. So yeah, that's it. Okay. So I'm going through pretty fast, so I'm going to pause for questions before I get into weeding. Let me check the list that Tammy sent me. Okay, there's a couple in here that I have not talked about, so I'll mention them here. There is a question about marking calendars with patrons at the door. How long do you keep them? If there's no names attached, if it's just like tick marks, I would probably keep those until you compiled those numbers into another document. For example, if you're doing it for patron count and it's just ticks, but at the end of the year, you put in the number into the bibliostat, you don't need to keep those old calendars because you've got those numbers already reported in digital, or you've put them in another, maybe a report to the board. If you do monthly reports, like last month we had, 40 people come through during this week or this month. Well, you've got those numbers. You may not need to keep the tick marks. If you are using patron names for this and also like computer signups, I would not just remove, but destroy those records as soon as possible, because that is a patron record. This patron came into the library at this time and used this resource. According to library guidelines, that type of information should not be held any longer than is absolutely necessary. So get the numbers off of computer use, get them into another document, and destroy those sign-up sheets. So I know that sounds kind of rash, but again, it leans on the privacy guidelines that libraries follow, as opposed to any other record keeping. ALA Code of Ethics, yep. And there's also some state statute on confidentiality of library records, and having loose pieces of paper kind of defeats that. So there's a couple of good guidelines for you. If the city has electronic trail, does the paper copies have to be kept at all? Again, it kind of depends on how is the workflow. Can you get to those records as easily as anyone else? Then yeah, maybe you don't need to keep any of the paper documents. But if it is a closed system, as like they won't give you the data upon request, you may have to duplicate that work and have your own. Okay, and then there's questions like how long do you keep the paper versus the digital? In some cases, you need to keep a paper copy. I believe my understanding of, say, open meeting acts means minutes and agenda. There has to be some sort of paper format, except for certain institutions like the largest of libraries and school districts. I did not see an exception built in there for public libraries under, say, the size of first-class cities. So villages and smaller cities, you may still need to keep those in paper. Internal documentation that isn't part of that Open Meeting Act or other grant or donor guidelines, an electronic copy should suffice. And just as long as you trust that computer system. All right. I think that covers related questions. So let's talk about weeding. Okay, I don't know about you, but when I finally get around to cleaning up documents, there's a lot of documents. And I suggest you tackle small amounts at one time. I don't know if any of you have heard about decision fatigue. It uses some other terms, but there are some studies that each and every decision you make reduces your amount to make decisions later that day. That's why some like, if any of you remember Steve Jobs, he always wore black turtleneck and jeans. One decision he did not have to make during the day meant he could make a better decision later on when a business depended on it. So don't try to tackle like a whole file cabinet at once unless you know it's all going to be the same thing and you can make two decisions as opposed to sheet by sheet by sheet decisions. In the end, you'll start being inconsistent with your criteria on what to keep and what not to keep. You'll choose poorly, and there are going to be some times where it tends to lead to more decisions you regret the next day after you slept on it. So if you get home after our day at work and someone asks you, what do you want for supper, and you can't decide, there is an actual decision fatigue and you have hit it. So at least that's why I keep telling my family some days. As your process goes, and I'm guilty of this, probably more than anyone, you have your stack of papers. You take the top one, you look at it, and then you decide later, and it goes onto another stack. You are just creating more work for yourself because you'll have to go through a stack that's only slightly smaller. As you go through, you're either filing it, you're going to discuss that paper with some specific person or group, or you're going to recycle or shred it. You're making actionable items with every decision. It's either this is going to be filed right away, this is going to be removed, or this is something someone else has to work with me to decide. You're not just going to say, I am deciding this later and creating just a slightly smaller pile. It is tough because sometimes, in that stack, there's stuff you will make, there's stuff I can make definitive decisions on. So I want to get to those. I'll just deal with these later. But later, you're only getting that much out of a pile of that much. So don't put off that decision on file, remove, collaborate. And then keep your new stuff in check. And it might be a good start before you start tackling the file cabinets, examine your procedures of dealing with the stuff coming in on a daily basis. If you can get that stuff sorted right away, so it never gets added to the backlog, you're that much closer to getting done with the project. That stack will start to shrink faster if you're not adding more stuff to it. So I know it seems odd. It's like, I've got this much backlog. I can't fit anything new in there. Well, take the time, get your new stuff in order as it comes in, and you will find that project happens a lot faster because you're deciding to do something with that document as opposed to, I'll decide later. Okay, so let's review some guidelines. And I'm not seeing too many just questions. So either you're getting the gist of it or I am extremely boring, which I know documents can be really boring. So, but let's talk about Kentucky. They have a specific guidelines for public libraries and library boards. So I'm just going to scroll down a little bit so you can kind of get a flavor of it. I will mention, and I did give give Tammy a link to a bunch of different guidelines so you can review them at your leisure. If you look at them, you will notice that some states treat things differently. That's the nature of records retention. There are only a few things that there's going to be a universal answer for. So just want to let you to know. Okay, I did see a question pop up in chat, Lori. I will get to that in just a little bit. So with Kentucky's, they have, okay, A genealogy file. Oops. It describes it. So that way someone down the line doesn't have to guess what you meant by genealogy file. So if you're creating your own records retention, examples might be a good idea to put in there. Contents, what type of thing is usually a genealogy file? Their retention and disposition, they retain genealogy permanently. Because honestly, genealogy, it has a lifetime worth. You know, people are always rediscovering genealogy. You could potentially have someone come in anytime at any level looking for genealogy. So that makes sense. Donor receipt, register a receipt file. Again, retained permanently. Okay, so that matches some of the things I've seen. I'm going to move down a little bit. Okay, patron transaction file. So the check-in, check-out records. Retain until superseded, then destroy. Basically, it's like once the book is returned and if there's no fines or anything, that is removed from the system. We do not keep long-term patron records on what they have and have not checked out. Again, kind of going towards the ALA Code of Ethics of privacy of records, and also, I don't know if Kentucky has a confidentiality clause in their state statutes towards libraries, but this is how they've decided to handle that, is an actual policy in there. Public internet workstation reservation record. So if a library does a sign up for use of a computer station, retain until no longer useful, then destroy. They're very clear about that. Destroy those sign up records. Again, you've got the statistics you need. You don't need to prove that so-and-so used this computer at this time on this date. That goes away. So this is kind of how the state of Kentucky has built theirs. So it's a very short document. It's only 3 pages. A lot of the other business things are in their city retention records policy. This focuses strictly on library stuff. So check-in, check-out, E-rate, they actually included in their official policy or in their official guidelines. Right, we'll look at Wisconsin's now. This one's a few years old. I have not seen that they are moving to amend it before their expiration date of 2027. And yeah, you're right. Nebraska does not have a comparable list for all libraries. In the folder that you'll get a link to, I did include a link to the Lincoln libraries, but that is the only one that I've seen publicly available. And it is not statewide, it is specifically for Lincoln libraries. So it may or may not be applicable to you. I wanted to bring up Wisconsin state because it's laid out really well as well. So board, bylaws, PII, that's publicly identifiable information. No, there's no publicly identifiable information in a set of bylaws. So no patron records. Confidential. Nope, bylaws are not public or not private. In fact, they're quite public. Event and destroy. Okay, this one's not so good as the definition. Event is superseded. What they're saying is if the board passes new bylaws, you get rid of the old ones. In Wisconsin, their guideline is for annual reports, you keep them for the current year plus 2 years after, and then you are free to destroy them. Okay, different tack. That is their minimum. You have to keep current plus 2 years. I want to get into some other ones. Request for reconsideration of library materials. So if the library has a challenge, this kind of describes that. They have, yes, in the public identifiable information. So this will have some publicly, there will be a name of the person who challenged it. Is it confidential? No, they do not consider these confidential information, probably because these forms go in front of the library board in an open meeting. So there's really no way to keep that confidential. Their guideline, keep it for event plus 6 years. Their definition of event is when the board or the library decides what to do with this challenge. And then they keep it for 6 years after that. Then destroy using their confidential policy, their policy of destroying confidential information. So this will give you some ideas, not just of some timelines, but also some definitions if you want to create your own records retention. And again, what I've told you, what Kentucky has in some of theirs, what Wisconsin has in theirs, you're seeing some different timelines. And so that's where those decisions are going to have to be made at a local level, because Nebraska doesn't have statewide for some of these. Okay. I want to point out one last example, because they do it a really different way. This is Geneva, New York. Their retention policy is organized not by type of record, but how long you keep the record. So a different system, that must mean their filing systems are also different, because it's probably geared by, this is the year we destroy these records. There might be some index files on, if you're looking up something particular, how to find that in this, but it's a different way of handling it. From my reading of it, it is geared towards how soon can we get rid of these records? And we don't want to dilly-dally about it and guess. It's like 1 year, things are gone. So these are 3 different approaches. 2 are state guidelines. 1 is an actual policy by a library. So it'll be up to you to decide how you want to handle that. So let's get back here. Questions? There was a question in the chat from Lori. How long do I keep statistics? That's a good question. So my general advice is, if you do the annual survey that the commission asks you to, the bibliostat, and you keep that, your other records that are reflected in that, you could probably dispose of if you wish, as long as you're keeping a copy of that bibliostat. I would recommend keeping a local copy. I know that the commission keeps those as well, but sometimes it's easier just to open up your own files and grab a copy of that. If you do not have those, the commission will work with you to get copies of previous years. I don't know how far back they would be able to do when they're actually doing the survey. So if you're looking at archival, you may want to have that discussion with them well before the next survey starts, which will be, I think, November is when that process starts up again. And if you're going back a ways, they may ask, it's like, we can get you last year's because we're busy on getting the next year's coming up, and then we'll revisit those older ones after. But that's their decision. I don't want to speak for them. So, other questions? Let's see here. Try to see if we'll go ahead and stop the share here. And if you want, at this point, if you want to say something, feel free to unmute your mic. Okay. Okay, run statistics every month. How long to keep the final reports and backup data? So by final reports, I'm going to assume you mean the year-end compilation, but if not, feel free to correct me. I'm going to start talking about year-end, and if it's different, I'll just add on to that. But If you are keeping year-end statistics, unless you plan on doing comparative, like we were at this point last year and we're at this point this year in the same month, then I don't know if you really need to keep month by month. It can be useful to do comparisons. If you are going to keep any, I might suggest 5 to 10, depending on your local situation, but definitely if it's a year end, then you may not need to keep any. Do a final report to the board each month. In this case, it will be attached to the minutes of the board meeting. And so you're probably already keeping a copy because it is a board document. And I'm assuming the board is meeting it under open meeting laws. So that should be kept along with the minutes and agenda of that meeting. If you want to keep a separate copy for your own reference, that'll be on your case. But again, that is my interpretation of open meeting law and of document retention related to those. The city attorney may have a slightly different one. I do not think that's been an area that has been challenged by a court case. That's sometimes really the only way we get clear vision of what that law really means, is if someone went to court about it. So I tend to veer off on, if it's introduced in the meeting, it needs to be kept with all the meeting documents. Just that way there's a complete picture of what happened at that meeting. Your city attorney may have other opinions. So hopefully to answer your question, Lori. Any other? Questions or comments? It's challenging to talk about documents in a webinar. It really is. So thank you all for sticking with it, the event. I had thought about bringing samples, but I don't think it would translate very well on a small camera screen. So. All righty. Not seeing. Oh yeah, the difference between states. Yeah, there is, as far as I can tell, there's no federal guidelines at all for a lot of things like this. So each state has had to create their own. I imagine down the line there might be more cross-pollination of ideas as we see the results of some of these decisions. But for now, yeah, it's very different. And Nebraska is not the only state that has no library-specific ones. A lot of the decisions made in Nebraska are geared towards just city government in general, but the library-specific needs are just left for us to figure out. So. I'll see no other
suggestions for library.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions. If you want, feel free to contact me directly and we can spend some time talking about it. Again, Tammy is another great resource for you in your system. So thank you for giving me a chance to talk about a topic we don't talk enough about. Maybe we don't want to, but it is important. So thank you very much.
Yes, everyone deals with the documents. So thank you, Scott.